Dragons aren't hard to come by in your typical fantasy RPG, and they're usually backed up by extraordinary historic power that makes the player tremble in fear for what they could be capable of when they encounter them. Or, at least that's what you would expect out of an interaction with a beast so monumental. It's a shame, but there aren't an abundance of properly executed dragons in the fantasy genre of video games. Examples like Skyrim are centered around these mythical powerhouses, and they still fail to give them proper scale. A disappointment to almost nobody, though, was when George R.R. Martin and FromSoft banded together to craft the fantasy fever dream Elden Ring, including a presence of dragons like no other had prior in gaming. With a mix of what they call modern and ancient dragons placed throughout the lands between, Elden Ring successfully gives you a refreshing take on a previously perceived stale fantasy archetype. In this video, I'll be going over Elden Ring and its phenomenally fresh take on dragons as grand-scale enemies, showing just what makes them feel so unique compared to other dragons you've seen throughout gaming. If you enjoy this video, please subscribe, as over 98% of you who watch aren't subscribed to the channel. To start, in the lands between, there are two kinds of dragons you'll run into: the modern dragons and the ancient dragons. The modern dragons take on the appearance you would typically expect out of a dragon, and you get to experience one almost right out of the gate. Agheel is massive in size, boasting a head the size of a train cart and wielding a fiery breath attack that would send any tarnished running with their tail between their legs. While being on the more basic side, there is something magical to point out about how Elden Ring handles the presentation of these winged beasts. As I mentioned, the dragon Agheel is found towards the very beginning of the game, but this doesn't take anything away from the thrill of watching it approach, as the scale of just how big this thing is starts to set in. For its battlefield to have needed an entire lake, the magnitude of the power that this beast possesses is clear to anybody with eyes. Maybe even just ears would do the job. Compare this to the more random encounters you get from Skyrim's dragons, for instance. There's nothing that sets each of these encounters apart, other than the area you may have one inconvenience you in. Even the more scripted dragons have fight instances that feel dull as bricks. If there was no dialogue to surround these scenarios, I'd have no context for what sets these named dragons apart from the typical ones that you would run into throughout the game. If Agheel is too boring for you with his fire breath that's typical of the dragons you would normally think of, then wander out to Liurnia Lakes, where you can encounter Smarog the Glintstone Dragon. This thing may look cool, yes, but most could glean that it has a magical inspired design given the area that it's in. But if you take a look at the description to Glintstone Breath, you'll find that this beast was as normal as Agheel once upon a time. But due to devouring the sorcerers throughout the college ground, over time he became corrupted by the glintstones they possessed. I can't tell Alduin from Paarthurnax, from this dragon, from that dragon. I just feel what I am to believe to be the strongest entities in Skyrim aren't getting across beyond what I'm told to be the case. One of the most threatening elements in Elden Ring is the Scarlet Rot. I have no idea what the story of decaying Exeeks to be as I approach it, but I can draw conclusions about its power, or even lack thereof, just from its appearance and how the Scarlet Rot seems to have infected its entire being. Every dragon that exists in Elden Ring gives you its context through its presentation and the different key highlights that are implemented to set them apart from one another. If we didn't have the blades to tell us about how frightening Alduin and his cast of dragons were, we would probably just treat them as another XP source with a dragon soul to boot. Dragons aren't even meant to be the highlighting force in Elden Ring, yet they're given some of the greatest attention to detail in any example shown in fantasy video games as a whole. The player's only real motivation in killing these beasts is to later engage in dragon communion with their hearts to obtain new and supremely powerful incantations. Even this dragon communion is yet another route taken by Elden Ring in diversifying their approach to supplying the dragons with a scale to intimidate the player. Remember the magma worms that you would run into in the lands between? Those are tarnished warriors who overindulged in this dragon communion and fell victim to its curse. You can tell that these landbound creatures have dragon-like qualities with their scales and now flightless wings, suggesting the fact that they were merely imitating the stature of a real dragon. This isn't even Elden Ring's main draw with their dragons, and what was even an aspect that you see Skyrim had attempted in its storyline as well: the integration of intellectual understanding between man and dragon. The ancient dragons once ruled over the lands between prior to the conception of the Erd Tree. Possessing the ability to take a human form in addition to their complex dragon anatomy, the ancient dragons proved to be highly intellectual. This is immediately portrayed by the ancient dragon Lansax as she hoists up a glaive of red lightning with her front legs and seems to have a masterful control of her 8 limbs altogether. From the description of the Lansax's glaive incantation, Lansax was the sister of Fortisax. It is said that she took on the form of a human to commune with the knights as a priestess of the ancient dragon cult. There's some real weight here. Little did we know that the concept of dragons was a meddling force in the overarching narrative of the Golden Order in the Elden Ring. Remnants of this conflict can be found in the golden city of Leyndell, where a gargantuan stone carcass of the ancient dragon Grandsax lies as a statue, along with the legendary armament, the Bolt of Grandsax. The description of which states how this dragon was the only entity to have ever broken the walls of Leyndell, emphasizing the ancient dragon's enormous scale of power in comparison to what we see our own Tarnish to be capable of. All of these bits and pieces of lore culminate into a sense that these dragons had a real impact in the state of the Golden Order as it stands when you're traversing the lands between, providing a sense that you're dealing with foes possessing some serious strength given their influence in a war with the demigods. Godwyn the Golden was notable for befriending his fallen foe Fortisax after engaging with him in battle. This bond would continue through the process of Godwyn being killed in the Night of Black Knives, as Fortisax would attempt to thwart off the death blight festering within Godwyn's soulless, half-dead corpse rotting in the deep-root depths. The Tarnish can eventually confront Fortisax deep within a dream after completing Fia's questline, where we find him as Lich Dragon Fortisax, after he had succumbed to the death blight within Godwyn's being while trying to defend him from rotting entirely. It almost feels like we're putting down a loyal companion who couldn't quite save his beloved friend and paid the price for it himself. This is a dragon we're talking about, and it feels so natural, which is the absolutely magical part about it. In an effort to make dragons a more secondary source of threat and intimidation to the plot of the story, Elden Ring at the end of the day ended up giving them surprisingly heavy influence in how you see the world through your playthrough. The state of the Golden Order is not the way it is without the presence of dragons, past and present. To mention the Elden Ring without bringing up one of its most ancient Elden Lords would be entirely disrespectful to the mighty legend. The Dragon Lord Placidusax was Elden Lord in a time before the Erd Tree and Queen Marika, and has evidence of battles waged in the lands between against foes like Godfrey in his path to becoming Elden Lord. Such evidence can be found in the severed heads that once made Placidusax even mightier, proving Godfrey's feats of conquering it no joke. It's quite odd now that I mention it to have Godfrey introduce himself as the first Elden Lord considering this information, but maybe he isn't trying to slight his mighty foe by just taking his title and neglecting its history, and that he's just referencing being the first Elden Lord under this new order. Back to Placidusax though, it's incredible for an optional boss to have such a historic influence within the main plot of the grand storyline, considering that it isn't very commonly talked about through the lands between, and knowing how convoluted of a method it is to get to this boss makes it feel like you really aren't meant to stumble upon it and gain the context of its history. Placidusax may have one of the most epic boss fights to ever exist in a video game, and this is evident by the many devastating abilities put on display in the arena beyond time. Golden flames, beams of destruction, and even the familiar bolts of red lightning, but this time in the shape of the Bolt of Grandsax. As mighty as Placidusax is, nobody but the Tarnish was destined to engage in combat with him ever again, as the Dragon Lord laid dormant within a realm where time doesn't pass in expectation of his god's return. Seriously though, what gives FromSoft? Lying in a grave lets me fight a two-headed dragon, but remember he was once a many-headed dragon. I thought I had seen it all in gaming. If you enjoyed this video, please check out the rest of my channel, and consider leaving a like and subscribing, as it really helps me out. Thank you.